restaurant smelled of roasted garlic and cheap wine. From his shadowed table in the corner, Victor watched the woman who had spent the last 2 months changing his bandages laugh at a joke told by a man in a sensible beige sweater. Her smile was genuine, easy. It was a smile she had never once given him. Victor felt a quiet, ugly thing uncoil in his chest. He didn't just want the man gone. He wanted to erase him. The sting of the antiseptic was sharp, but Victor didn't flinch. He sat on the edge of the oversized leather armchair in his study, his dress shirt unbuttoned to the waist. The air in the room was heavy smelling of old paper scotch and the clinical chemical scent of iodine. "You're tensing again." Clara didn't look up. Her voice was flat, carrying the mechanical exhaustion of someone operating on her 14th hour of a shift. She peeled the soiled gauze back from his ribs. The bullet had taken a clean path through his right side, missing his lung by a fraction of an inch. It was a sloppy hit. The men responsible were already buried in a foundation pour on the south side of the city. "It hurts," Victor said. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp. "It's supposed to hurt," Clara replied. She tossed the bloody gauze into a biohazard bag resting on a silver tray. "You were shot, Mr. Moretti. Your body is trying to knit torn muscle and skin back together while you stubbornly refuse to stay in bed." She grabbed a fresh cotton swab, dunking it heavily in the brown iodine. Victor watched her hands. She wore pale blue latex gloves. Her hands were small but brutally efficient. She didn't hesitate. She didn't tremble. When his men had brought her to the estate 6 weeks ago, pulled from the ER of a struggling downtown hospital with an envelope of cash thick enough to pay off her student loans twice over, she had been terrified. She had shaken so badly she dropped her stethoscope. That fear had burned off somewhere around week 3. Now she just looked tired. She pressed the swab into the puckered, angry red flesh of his side. Victor drew in a sharp breath through his nose. His jaw locked. "Sorry," she muttered, though she didn't sound it. She worked with the rhythm of a mechanic, changing a spark plug. "You aren't," Victor observed. Clara finally glanced up. Her eyes were a muddy hazel, framed by dark circles that spoke of cheap coffee and fractured sleep. Her brown hair was scraped back into a messy claw clip, a few loose strands sticking to the sweat on her forehead. She wasn't beautiful in the loud, polished way of the women Victor usually kept in his orbit. She was practical, grounded, real. "No," she admitted, reaching for the medical tape. "I'm not. If you wanted a soft touch, you should have hired a massage therapist. I'm here to make sure you don't die of sepsis." She taped the fresh gauze down, smoothing the edges with her thumbs. The pressure of her fingers against his skin was firm. It was the only time anyone touched him anymore, without the intent to kill him or the desire to take his money. He realized with a faint twist of disgust at his own weakness that he looked forward to the dressing changes. "Done," she said, stepping back and stripping off the gloves. They landed in the bag with a soft, rubbery snap. "Your temperature is normal. The redness around the exit wound is fading. If you keep the physical exertion to a minimum for another week, you'll be out of the woods." "I have meetings," Victor said, pulling his shirt closed. He began fastening the buttons with slow, deliberate movements. "Take them sitting down." Clara moved to the sink in the corner of the study, washing her hands with aggressive thoroughness. "And stop drinking whiskey with your pain medication. Your liver is doing enough work." "I pay you to fix the holes in me, Clara, not to dictate my diet." She dried her hands on a paper towel, her back to him. "You pay me for my medical expertise. My expertise says the alcohol thins your blood and slows the healing. If you bleed out in your sleep, your men will probably shoot me. So yes, I'm dictating your diet. Drink water." She turned around, grabbing her worn canvas tote bag from the floor. She looked at her watch, a cheap digital thing with a scratched plastic face. "I'll be back tomorrow at 8, she said, heading for the heavy oak door. Wait. The word left Victor's mouth before he authorized it. Clara paused, her hand hovering over the brass doorknob. She looked back over her shoulder, an eyebrow raised in silent question. Victor didn't know why he stopped her. The room felt suddenly too quiet. The hum of the air purifier in the corner was grating. He wanted her to stay. The realization felt like a second bullet lodged somewhere deep in his chest. It was pathetic. He was Victor Moretti. Men crossed the street to avoid his shadow. And here he was, desperate for 5 more minutes, with a woman who smelled like rubbing alcohol and indifference. "Your check," Victor improvised, gesturing to a sealed white envelope sitting on his mahogany desk. "Take it." Clara looked at the envelope, then at him. She walked back across the room, her sneakers squeaking softly on the hardwood. She picked up the envelope, slipping it into her bag without checking the amount. She knew it was exact. Victor never shorted people who were useful to him. "Thank you," she said. It was polite, completely devoid of warmth. She turned and walked out. The heavy door clicked shut behind her. Victor sat in the silence of his study, the dull ache in his side, pulsing in time with his heartbeat. He stared at the empty space where she had just been standing. He poured himself a glass of water. 2 weeks later, the cane was gone. Victor walked with a slight limp, a phantom drag in his right leg when the weather turned damp, but he was whole again. His empire, which had held its breath while he bled, resumed its violent, lucrative machinery. Clara still came to the estate, but her visits had dwindled from daily necessity to bi-weekly checkups. She took his vitals, inspected the fading pink scars, and asked him mundane questions about his mobility. The dynamic had shifted. He was no longer the broken man bleeding on his leather sofa. He was the boss again. The guards at the front gate stood a little straighter. The maids kept their eyes on the floor. Clara, however, didn't seem to notice the shift. It was a Friday afternoon. The sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the sunroom was pale and weak, a symptom of the dying autumn. Victor sat at a glass table, reviewing shipping manifests. Clara was packing up her blood pressure cuff. Her phone vibrated on the glass tabletop. The sound was sharp, vibrating angrily against the glass. Clara's head snapped up. She wiped her hands on her jeans, reaching for the device. Victor didn't look up from his papers, but his eyes tracked the movement. He watched the way her face changed as she read the notification. The tight professional mask she wore inside his house cracked. Her lips curved upward. It wasn't a polite smile. It was a soft, private thing. She quickly typed a response, her thumbs flying over the screen, and flipped the phone face down. "Good news?" Victor asked. His voice was casual, a dangerous kind of smooth. Clara zipped her bag, just confirming plans. Plans. Victor signed his name at the bottom of a manifest, the scratch of his fountain pen loud in the quiet room. "I thought you worked the night shift at St. Jude's on Fridays. I took the weekend off." She slung the bag over her shoulder. "My first one in 4 months." Victor set the pen down. He finally looked at her. She was wearing a cream-colored sweater that looked soft to the touch, and her hair was actually down for once, falling in loose natural waves past her shoulders. She had put on mascara. He hadn't noticed it when she walked in, but he saw it now. She looked expectant, alive. "Where are you going?" he asked. The question crossed the invisible boundary they had established. It wasn't about his health. It wasn't about her paycheck. Clara's posture stiffened. She gripped the strap of her bag. "Out. In the city." "The city is dangerous, Clara. I'll manage." She offered a tight, forced smile. "I've lived here my whole life, Mr. Moretti. I know which streets to avoid." "Who is it?" The words hung in the air. Victor felt a strange, cold pressure building behind his ribs. It wasn't rational. She was an employee, a contractor. Her time outside these walls was hers. but the image of her smiling at that phone screen burned in his mind like acid. Clara stared at him. The muddy hazel of her eyes hardened into something defensive. "Excuse me, you're dressing up. You took time off. You're smiling at your phone like a teenager." Victor leaned back in his chair, lacing his fingers together over his stomach. He kept his expression perfectly neutral, a blank wall hiding a sudden violent storm. "Who are you seeing?" With all due respect, Clara said, her voice dropping an octave. "That is absolutely none of your business. You know the layout of my home. You know my security rotations. You know the exact nature of the injuries I sustained, and consequently, that I am vulnerable." Victor delivered the lie with practiced ease. He framed it as security, paranoia, a mob boss protecting his assets. He refused to acknowledge the primal territorial anger spiking in his blood. "Anyone you associate with is my business. If they ask questions..." "He's an accountant," Clara snapped, cutting him off. The defiance in her voice made the guard standing outside the glass doors shift nervously. No one interrupted Victor Moretti. "His name is Greg. He does taxes for mid-level corporate firms. He doesn't know who you are. He doesn't know where I am right now. And he certainly doesn't care about your security rotations. He thinks I'm privately nursing a wealthy elderly man recovering from a hip replacement." Victor went entirely still. Greg. The name sounded like oatmeal. It was bland, safe, pathetic. "An accountant," Victor repeated softly. "Yes." Clara took a step backward toward the door. "We are going to dinner, at a public restaurant, where no one will shoot at us. I'll see you on Tuesday, Mr. Moretti." She didn't wait for him to dismiss her. She turned and walked out. Victor sat alone in the sunroom for a long time. He watched the weak autumn sun dip below the tree line, casting long, bruised shadows across the floor. He picked up his phone and dialed a number. Tommy, Victor said when his second-in-command answered. "Yeah, boss. Need something." Clara Hayes. She just left the gates. Put someone on her. "I want to know exactly where she goes tonight. I want a name, an address, and eyes on whoever she's meeting." There was a brief pause on the line. Tommy was smart. He knew better than to question an order, but he also knew this wasn't standard procedure for a civilian nurse. "You think she's leaking info?" Victor looked at the empty doorway. He remembered the soft curve of her smile when she looked at the phone. He remembered the smell of vanilla on her skin. "Just do it," Victor said, and hung up. The restaurant was called Luigi's. It was a hole in the wall in a gentrified neighborhood, the kind of place that tried to compensate for mediocre food with excessive charm. It had red checkered tablecloths, empty Chianti bottles used as candle holders, and a persistent smell of garlic and burnt butter. Victor hated it immediately. He sat in a high-backed wooden booth in the darkest corner of the room. He wore a dark charcoal suit, devoid of a tie, the collar of his shirt open. He looked entirely out of place among the college students on cheap dates and tired couples eating pasta. Two of his men sat at a table near the front entrance, nursing half-empty beers and keeping a perimeter. Across the room, 3 tables away, sat Clara. She had taken off her coat. Underneath, she wore a simple dark green dress that hugged the lines of her shoulders and draped softly over her hips. It wasn't flashy. It didn't scream for attention. But it made Victor's chest tight. He had only ever seen her in shapeless scrubs or oversized sweaters. Seeing the elegant line of her neck, the way the fabric moved when she shifted in her chair, it felt like a secret he was stealing. Sitting across from her was Greg. Greg was exactly what Victor expected. He had thinning brown hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and a blue button-down shirt tucked into khakis. He looked like a man who drove the speed limit and worried about his cholesterol. He was currently gesturing animatedly with a piece of garlic bread, telling a story that had Clara laughing. It was a real laugh. Her head tilted back, her eyes crinkling at the corners. The sound of it carried over the low din of the restaurant. Victor reached for his glass of water. His hand was remarkably steady, considering the sudden, overwhelming urge he had to walk over to the table and drive a steak knife through Greg's hand. He took a slow sip, his dark eyes fixed on the couple. He watched Greg lean forward, his elbows on the table, invading Clara's space. He watched Clara lean in to meet him. She didn't pull away. She looked comfortable, safe. Victor knew what he was doing was insane. He was a man who commanded hundreds, who controlled shipping ports and politicians. He didn't stalk his employees. He didn't waste his time sitting in cheap Italian restaurants. But sitting in his empty, cavernous mansion, knowing she was out here smiling for this profoundly average man, had felt like a physical itch beneath his skin. He couldn't ignore it. He had to see it. He had to ruin it. He waited until their main courses arrived. Plates of heavy steaming pasta were set between them. Greg reached across the table, his fingers brushing the back of Clara's hand as he offered her the grated parmesan. Clara smiled. "Thanks." Victor stood up. He moved with the silent, predatory grace that had kept him alive in his world for so long. He didn't rush. He simply navigated the narrow aisles between the tables until he was standing directly behind Greg's chair. Clara saw him first. She had a forkful of pasta halfway to her mouth. Her hand froze. The color instantly drained from her face, leaving her pale and wide-eyed. The polite, comfortable date night mask shattered. For a split second, Victor saw real, unadulterated fear in her eyes. It was the same look she had the night she was dragged into his house. It satisfied him and sickened him at the same time. "Clara," Victor said. His voice was smooth, a velvet wrapping over a steel blade. Greg jumped, startled by the sudden voice directly behind his ear. He turned around, blinking up at Victor through his smudged lenses. He took in the expensive suit, the cold, dead eyes, the sheer physical presence of the man looming over him. Greg swallowed hard. "Oh," Greg said, his voice cracking slightly. "Can we help you?" Victor didn't look at Greg. He kept his eyes locked on Clara. "I didn't mean to interrupt your evening. I was just having dinner across the room and saw you." Clara slowly lowered her fork to the plate. Her knuckles were white. "Mr. Moretti," she managed to say. Her voice was strained tight with suppressed panic. "What are you doing here?" "I enjoy the ambiance," Victor lied effortlessly. He finally shifted his gaze down to Greg. He let the silence stretch for 3 agonizing seconds. He looked at Greg the way a butcher looks at a slab of meat, assessing dismissive, entirely unimposed. "And you are?" Greg nervously wiped his hands on his napkin and stood up, extending a hand. "Greg. Greg Miller. I'm a friend of Clara's." Victor looked at the extended hand. He didn't take it. Greg's smile faltered. He awkwardly pulled his hand back, letting it drop to his side. He looked from Victor to Clara, sensing the sudden suffocating tension in the air, but entirely unable to decode it. Clara mentioned she was nursing a gentleman recovering from surgery. Are you the, patient?" "I am," Victor said. He stepped closer to the table, forcing Greg to take a half step back to maintain personal space. Victor rested his hands on the back of the empty chair next to Clara. "She has been instrumental in my recovery. Her hands are quite skilled." The phrasing was deliberate. He saw Clara flinch. "Right. We're glad to see you're up and about," Greg said, offering a nervous chuckle. He sat back down, clearly wanting the interaction to end. Victor didn't move. He stood there, a dark monolith casting a shadow over their table. He looked at Clara's plate. "The veal—" "Yes," Clara snapped. Anger was beginning to replace the shock. She glared up at him, her muddy hazel eyes flashing. "It's very good. We were just enjoying it. Privately." The dismissal was clear. Any normal man would have apologized and walked away. Victor pulled out the empty chair next to her and sat down. "I've always found the veal here a little dry," Victor said, conversationally, signaling to a passing waiter with a subtle lift of his chin. "But the wine covers the sins of the kitchen." Greg stared at him, bewildered. "Are you joining us?" "Just for a moment," Victor said. The waiter arrived, instantly unnerved by Victor's presence. "Bring the bill for this table to my men at the front, and bring a bottle of the 15 Barolo. Glasses for everyone." "Right away, sir," the waiter squeaked, practically running toward the bar. "You don't need to do that," Clara said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. She leaned in toward him, smelling of that cheap vanilla perfume and the sudden sharp scent of adrenaline. "Leave. Now." Victor turned his head, his face inches from hers. He could see the pulse beating frantically at the base of her throat. "I'm just being polite, Clara. Thanking the man who is keeping my favorite nurse entertained." "She's a great girl," Greg chimed in, oblivious to the lethal undercurrents swirling across the table. He was trying to regain his footing, trying to assert some kind of claim. "We met at a coffee shop near my firm. I've been trying to get her to go out with me for weeks." Victor's eyes snapped back to Greg. The air temperature at the table seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Is that so? You're persistent." "I know what I want," Greg said, trying for a confident smile. Victor leaned back in his chair. He didn't smile back. He just stared. He stared until Greg's smile died entirely, until Greg shifted uncomfortably in his seat, suddenly acutely aware that he was out of his depth, in a pool he didn't even know existed. "It's a dangerous thing, Greg," Victor said quietly. The restaurant chatter faded into white noise. "Wanting something that doesn't belong to you. It leads to poor decisions. Accidents." Greg blinked. "I'm sorry, Victor." Clara's voice was a warning. It was the first time she had used his first name. It sent a jolt of electricity straight down his spine. She reached out under the table and gripped his wrist. Her fingers dug into his pulse point. "Stop it." He looked down at her hand on his arm. Then he looked up into her furious eyes. The jealousy that had driven him here morphed into something darker, heavier. He realized, sitting there, feeling the heat of her anger, that he didn't just want Greg out of the picture. He wanted to be the only thing she ever looked at. The waiter arrived with the wine, pouring it with trembling hands. Victor picked up his glass. He held it up in a mock toast. "To a speedy recovery," Victor said. He drank. The wine tasted like ash. He stood up, towering over the table once more. "Enjoy your evening, Greg. Take good care of her tonight, because tomorrow she belongs to me." He didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked out of the restaurant, leaving the bottle of expensive wine untouched on the checkered tablecloth. He knew Clara would be furious. He knew he had just blown up the careful professional wall she had built between them. But as he stepped out into the cool autumn air, his men falling into step behind him, Victor felt the first genuine smile pull at his lips in months. The game had finally changed. Tuesday morning arrived with a cold, driving rain that turned the city sky the color of wet cement. Victor sat behind his desk. He had been waiting for the heavy oak door of his study to open since 6 a.m. The ledger in front of him was full of numbers he wasn't reading. At precisely 8:15, the door swung open. Clara didn't knock. She walked in her canvas tote bag, hitting the floor with a heavy, angry thud. She wasn't wearing her scrubs. She wore a faded black denim jacket over a grey t-shirt, her hair pulled back into a severe knot. She didn't look like a nurse arriving for a shift. She looked like a woman showing up for a fight. "You ruined my weekend," she said. Victor slowly closed the ledger. He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands over his stomach. He felt a profound sense of satisfaction settling in his chest. "Good morning, Clara. I trust the veal agreed with you." "Do not play games with me," she snapped. closing the distance between them. She stopped at the edge of his desk, planting her hands flat on the polished mahogany. She leaned over, forcing him to look up at her. Her knuckles were white. "What you did on Friday wasn't a game. It was a threat. You terrified a perfectly nice man for absolutely no reason." "I secured my environment," Victor replied smoothly. "A man I don't know was getting too close to someone who has intimate knowledge of my home and my physical vulnerabilities. It was a security risk. I neutralized it." "He's a tax accountant, Victor, not an assassin. People can be bought. You're paranoid. I'm alive." Victor didn't raise his voice. He let his absolute calm act as a wall against her anger. "And in my line of work, paranoia is just a synonym for survival. I told you I didn't want you associating with people who might ask questions." Clara let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. She pushed off the desk, pacing a tight circle on the Persian rug. "You didn't go to that restaurant because of security. You didn't send men to follow me because you were worried about a data leak." She stopped pacing and pointed a finger at him. "You went there because you are a control freak, because you sit in this giant empty house giving orders to men who are terrified of you, and the second I step out of your little bubble you can't handle it. You wanted to humiliate me." Victor's jaw tightened. The satisfaction evaporated, replaced by a dark, simmering heat. She was entirely too perceptive. "I did not humiliate you. You marked your territory." Clara shouted the polite professional facade she had maintained for months, finally shattering into pieces. "You sat there towering over him, implying God knows what. Tomorrow she belongs to me. Do you hear yourself? I am your employee. I am a nurse. I do not belong to you." The silence in the room stretched until it felt brittle enough to snap. The rain lashed against the heavy window panes. Victor stood up. He moved around the desk, his presence filling the space between them. Clara held her ground, but her chin tilted up to keep eye contact. He stopped less than 2 feet away. He could see the faint pulse fluttering at her temple. He could smell the rain on her jacket. "Are you done?" he asked quietly. "I'm quitting." Clara reached into her pocket, pulling out an envelope. She slapped it onto the desk. "That's the advance for this week. I haven't cashed the check from Friday yet. I'll rip it up. Find another nurse." She bent down to pick up her bag. "Greg called you, didn't he?" Victor asked. Clara froze. Her hand hovered over the canvas straps. "He called you on Saturday." Victor continued, his voice devoid of sympathy. Probably stammered through an apology. Said he wasn't looking for drama. Said he thought it was best if you didn't see each other again. Clara stood up slowly. The anger in her eyes was replaced by a hollow, bitter exhaustion. "How do you know that?" "Because he is a coward," Victor said simply. "A man with a spine would have thrown a punch on Friday night. A man with a spine would have protected you." He folded the second a shadow crossed his path. "You're angry with me, Clara, but I did you a favor. I showed you exactly what kind of man he is. You don't get to decide what kind of man I need. You need a man who isn't afraid of the dark," Victor said. The word slipped out raw and unplanned. Clara stared at him. For a moment the tension shifted, turning heavy and breathless. Then she shook her head, stepping back. "I don't want a man who brings the dark with him. I'm leaving, Mr. Moretti. Keep the money." She turned toward the door. "You can't afford to leave," Victor stated. Clara stopped her hand on the brass knob. She didn't look back. "Watch me. St. Jude's isn't hiring back full-time staff until the next fiscal quarter," Victor said, reciting the information his men had gathered with cold precision. "Your rent on the apartment in the Heights is up in 3 weeks. The landlord is raising it by 20%. And your sister's tuition at the conservatory is due on the 1st of the month." Clara dropped her forehead against the heavy wood of the door. Her shoulders sagged. "You looked into my sister," she whispered. The fight drained out of her voice, leaving only revulsion. "You're a monster. I am a businessman. I protect my investments." Victor walked up behind her. He didn't touch her, but he stood close enough that she would feel the heat radiating from him. "You need the money. I need the medical care. There's no reason to let pride ruin a perfectly functional arrangement." He reached past her, his arm brushing her shoulder, and pulled the envelope off the desk. He tucked it firmly into the outer pocket of her canvas bag. "I'll double your weekly rate," Victor said softly, staring at the back of her neck. "And I will pay the conservatory directly, in full, for the entire 4-year program." Clara turned around. She looked trapped. She looked exhausted, and for the first time she looked at him not as a patient, but as the predator he truly was. "You think you can just buy my life?" she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I think I already have," Victor replied. "Go into the bathroom and wash your hands, Clara. It's time to check my stitches." The money was in the account by noon. Clara sat in her tiny, drafty kitchen, staring at her banking app on her phone. The string of zeros was obscene. It was enough to wipe out her debt, secure her apartment, and guarantee her sister's future without a single student loan. It was exactly what she had prayed for during those grueling 80-hour weeks at the hospital, and it made her feel sick to her stomach. She dropped the phone on the chipped formica table and buried her face in her hands. Greg was gone. Her quiet, normal weekends were gone. Victor Moretti had systematically dismantled her life, identifying every stress fracture and applying pressure until the walls caved in. Then he had built a gilded cage in the rubble and locked the door. The worst part wasn't the control. The worst part was that she had stayed. She told herself it was for her sister. She justified it as a necessary evil, a temporary sacrifice. But sitting alone in her apartment, the memory of Victor standing behind her in the study, his voice low and gravelly, refused to fade. "You need a man who isn't afraid of the dark." The sheer gravity of him was terrifying, but it was also undeniable. When he looked at her, he actually saw her. Not just a nurse, not just a tired woman in cheap scrubs. He saw everything, and he wanted it. The next 3 weeks settled into a suffocating routine. Clara arrived at the estate every Tuesday and Friday. She performed her duties with clinical detachment. She took his blood pressure. She palpated his ribs. She checked the scar tissue. She refused to engage in small talk. She wore her oldest, least flattering clothes. She answered his questions with single syllables. Victor didn't push. He sat back and absorbed her coldness with a faint, knowing smirk. He had won the war. He didn't need to gloat over every battle. It was a Friday evening in late November when the fragile truce shattered. The weather had turned bitterly cold, the wind howling around the stone corners of the estate. Clara was packing up her bag in the library. Victor was standing by the fireplace, nursing a glass of amber liquid, staring into the flames. "You're limping today," Clara observed, flatly zipping her bag. "The cold," Victor replied, not turning around. "The muscle gets stiff. I can prescribe a muscle relaxant. I don't want pills." He finally turned to face her. The firelight cast harsh, flickering shadows across the sharp planes of his face. "You used to massage the scar tissue. That was when it was actively healing. Now it's just physical therapy. You have men for that. Hire a professional." She slung the bag over her shoulder. "Have a good weekend, Mr. Moretti. Stay." The command was soft but absolute. Clara paused. "My shift is over. Stay for a drink." He gestured to a crystal decanter on the heavy mahogany side table. "It's freezing outside. The roads are icing over. Warm up before you drive back to that uninsulated shoebox you call an apartment." "I don't drink with my patients. I'm not your patient anymore, Clara." Victor set his glass down on the mantel. He walked toward her, moving with the slow, deliberate pacing of a wolf circling a deer. The wound is closed. The infection is gone. You're just coming here out of habit. And obligation. Clara took a step back, her back hitting the edge of a heavy leather sofa. I come here because you are blackmailing me. I am funding you, he corrected, stopping inches away from her. There's a difference. Not from where I'm standing. She looked up at him, refusing to back down, even as her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She hated how close he was. She hated that she could smell the scotch on his breath and the expensive cologne on his skin. Victor reached out. He didn't grab her. He just lightly traced the line of her jaw with the back of his knuckles. His skin was rough, calloused. Clara sucked in a sharp breath. She didn't pull away. You're still angry, Victor murmured, his dark eyes tracking the movement of her throat as she swallowed. But you're not afraid of me anymore. You haven't been afraid of me since the first week. You overestimate yourself. Do I? His hand slid to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in the messy knot of her hair. He pulled just hard enough to tilt her head back, exposing the pale skin of her throat. If you were truly repulsed, you would have taken the money and run. Or you would have gone to the police. But you're still here, fighting me over every inch of ground. Clara grabbed his wrist. Her grip was tight. Let me go. I can't do that. Clara, he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He leaned in his mouth, hovering just inches from hers. You ruined my taste for everything else. You sit there looking at me like I'm a disease you have to cure, and it's the only real thing in my entire miserable life. The confession hung in the air between them, heavy and dangerous. It wasn't romantic. It was a raw, ugly admission of a parasitic need. Before Clara could respond, before she could push him away or pull him closer, the heavy oak doors of the library slammed open. Boss Tommy barked, stepping into the room. He was breathing hard, a matte black pistol already gripped in his right hand. Victor dropped his hand from Clara's neck instantly. The dark obsession vanished, replaced by cold, lethal focus. What? Perimeter breach on the north wall. Tommy said, his eyes darting quickly to Clara before snapping back to Victor. Cameras are down. Guards at the gate aren't responding. Victor's face turned to granite. Who? Looks like the Russians. Retaliation for the docks. Tommy stepped back into the hallway. They're already in the courtyard. We need to move to the basement. Now. The first gunshot sounded like a dry branch, snapping. It was followed instantly by the deafening shatter of glass. The massive floor-to-ceiling window at the far end of the library exploded inward, raining jagged shards over the antique rugs. Cold wind howled into the room, bringing with it the smell of ozone and burning rubber. Get down, Victor roared. He didn't wait for Clara to move. He lunged across the short distance between them, hitting her shoulder with his chest and driving her to the floor behind the heavy leather sofa. The air above them filled with the terrifying, percussive sound of automatic gunfire. Plaster rained down from the ceiling, dusting Clara's hair in white powder. Clara hit the floor hard, the breath knocked out of her lungs. She curled into a tight ball, her hands covering her ears. The noise was absolute, a physical weight pressing down on her skull. Books exploded off the shelves in bursts of shredded paper. Victor was crouched over her, his body a solid, immovable shield between her and the destruction. He drew a gun from a shoulder holster, hidden beneath his suit jacket. His movements were terrifyingly calm. He wasn't a man reacting to panic. He was a man going to work. Stay perfectly still, he ordered, his voice cutting through the ringing in her ears. He rose slightly, resting the barrel of his weapon on the top edge of the sofa. He fired 3 times in rapid succession. A heavy thud sounded from the other side of the room, followed by a wet, gargling noise. Tommy, Victor shouted over the din. Hallway is clear, Tommy yelled from the doorway. But they're coming through the kitchen. We have to move. Victor ducked back down, grabbing Clara by the collar of her denim jacket. We are running to the door. Keep your head down. Do not stop. If I fall, you leave me and run with Tommy. Do you understand? Clara looked at him, her eyes wide with raw animal terror. The cynical nurse was gone. This wasn't a bad shift in the ER. This was a war zone. She nodded frantically. Go! Victor hauled her to her feet, shoving her toward the doorway. Clara ran. She kept low, her sneakers slipping on the polished hardwood floors, dodging shattered vases and splintered wood. The hallway was a chaotic blur of shouting men and thick, acrid smoke. Tommy grabbed her arm, yanking her behind a marble pillar, just as a spray of bullets chewed up the wall where she had been a second before. Victor was right behind them, firing back down the corridor, suppressing the attackers long enough for Tommy to punch a code into a discreet keypad hidden behind a framed painting. A heavy steel door slid open with a mechanical hiss. In, Tommy barked, shoving Clara inside. Victor threw himself through the doorway just as Tommy hit the override switch. The heavy door slammed shut the locking mechanisms, engaging with a series of final heavy clanks. The sudden silence inside the room was staggering. Clara collapsed against the cold concrete wall, sliding down until she hit the floor. She dragged air into her burning lungs, her hands shaking so violently she couldn't clasp them together. It was a panic room. It was stark, lit by harsh fluorescent strips, lined with metal shelves holding water, MREs, and an arsenal of weapons that looked like they belonged in a military armory. Victor stood in the center of the room, his chest heaving. He ejected the spent magazine from his gun and slammed a fresh one home. He looked around the room, his eyes scanning for Tommy, who was already at a bank of monitors, frantically tapping keyboards to bring up internal camera feeds. Then Victor looked down. A dark, wet stain was spreading across the crisp white fabric of his dress shirt just below his left shoulder. Boss, Tommy said, turning around from the monitors. He saw the blood and swore violently in Italian. Clara's head snapped up. The medical training buried under a mountain of adrenaline and fear kicked in with ruthless efficiency. She scrambled to her feet, her shaking hands suddenly steadying as she crossed the small room. Sit down, she ordered, her voice cracking but authoritative. Victor looked at her, his eyes slightly glazed. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving the pain in its wake. It's a through and through. Feels clean. I didn't ask for a self-diagnosis. Sit down. Clara grabbed a metal folding chair from the corner and shoved it toward him. Victor sat. He let his head fall back against the concrete wall, letting out a low, ragged breath. Clara didn't have her canvas bag. It was buried under a pile of rubble in the library. She moved to the metal shelves, tearing open a plastic first aid kit. She grabbed trauma shears, gauze, and a bottle of sterile saline. She stood over him, grabbing the collar of his ruined shirt. She didn't bother unbuttoning it. She slid the trauma shears down the fabric, slicing it open and peeling it back from his skin. The bullet had passed through the meaty part of his shoulder. It was bleeding heavily, but it hadn't hit an artery. You're lucky, she muttered, packing the gauze tightly against the entry wound. An inch to the right, and it would have shattered your collarbone. I make my own luck. Victor rasped, his eyes fixed on her face. She was standing between his knees, leaning over him. Her hands were covered in his blood. Her face was smudged with plaster dust, her hair falling out of its knot in tangled strands. She looked ruined. She looked magnificent. Press here, Clara ordered, taking his uninjured hand and placing it firmly over the packed gauze. Hold it tight. She moved to his back to inspect the exit wound. She had to lean across his chest to reach behind him. The physical proximity was overwhelming. The smell of copper and gunpowder filled the small space. Victor didn't look at his wound. He looked at her. He watched the fierce, concentrated frown on her face as she worked to stop the bleeding. The artificial coldness they had maintained for weeks was entirely gone. burned away by the gunfire. "You didn't leave me," Victor said quietly. Clara paused, a roll of medical tape in her hand. She met his eyes. In the harsh fluorescent light, there was nowhere to hide. The truth was stark and undeniable. "I'm a nurse," she whispered, looking away. "I don't leave people bleeding." Victor reached up with his bloodied hand, catching her chin and forcing her to look back at him. His grip was weak, but the intensity in his eyes was blinding. "Liar," he breathed. Clara stared down at him. The harsh fluorescent lights of the bunker cast deep, bruised shadows under his eyes. He looked pale. He looked exhausted. But the grip of his bloody hand on her chin was like a vice. "I'm not lying," Clara said, her voice dropping to a harsh, fractured whisper. "You are." Victor's thumb brushed against her lower lip. His hand left a smear of crimson on her pale skin. "You run from everything else. You ran from the hospital. You ran from that pathetic accountant. You run every time I get too close. But right now, with men trying to tear my house apart, to put a bullet in my head, you aren't running." Clara jerked her chin out of his grasp. She grabbed the medical tape securing the thick pad of gauze over his shoulder with aggressive, jerky movements. "Because I was locked in a concrete box with you. My options were somewhat limited. You threw yourself in front of me before we even reached the hallway. I was falling. You pulled me toward the door. It was basic survival." Victor let his head rest back against the concrete. A low, humorless laugh rattled in his chest, turning into a wince as the movement pulled at his torn shoulder. "You will build 1,000 excuses before you admit the truth, Clara. It's fascinating to watch." Across the small room, Tommy cleared his throat. He hadn't turned away from the security monitors, keeping his back rigidly facing them, but his presence was a sudden jarring reminder that they were not alone. "Boss Tommy," said, his voice flat and professional. "Cameras in the East Wing just came back online. The Russians are retreating. Looks like our perimeter guards finally pinched them at the gates. Cops are going to be swarming the canyon road in about 10 minutes. Victor's demeanor shifted instantly. The raw, heavy intimacy evaporated, replaced by the calculating machinery of a man running an empire. "Casualties, or 3 of ours down in the courtyard. 2 more in the foyer." Tommy tapped a key, cycling through the feeds. They left 4 bodies behind. It was a sloppy hit. A message, not a decapitation strike. A sloppy message. Victor corrected his voice, hardening into something cold and metallic. "Call cleanup. Get the bodies out of the house before the sirens get close. Bribe the canyon patrol to block the lower access road. Tell them it was a transformer blowout. I don't want a single badge crossing my gates. On it." Tommy pulled a burner phone from his pocket and began dialing. Clara backed away from Victor. She looked down at her hands. They were coated in his blood. It was drying, turning a dark, rusty brown, flaking off her skin and settling under her fingernails. The metallic smell of it made her stomach turn. She walked over to a small metal sink in the corner of the bunker, turning on the tap. The water ran freezing cold. She scrubbed her hands with harsh industrial soap. She scrubbed until her skin was raw and stinging, but she couldn't wash away the feeling of his thumb against her mouth. "You run from everything else." She stared at her reflection in the polished metal mirror above the sink. Her hair was a disaster of plaster dust and sweat. Her eyes were hollow. She looked like a ghost. She had spent the last 2 months trying to convince herself that she was just an observer in this world, a contractor performing a service. She took the money, she changed the bandages, and she maintained her moral high ground. But as she stood in the subterranean bunker of a mob boss, listening to his lieutenant order the disposal of human bodies with the casual tone of someone ordering a pizza, the lie tasted like ash in her mouth. She hadn't just survived the attack. She had felt a terrifying primal surge of relief when Victor had pulled her down. She had trusted him. When the glass shattered and the world exploded, her first instinct hadn't been to run for the door. It had been to look for him. Clara. She turned the water off. She dried her hands on her jeans, ignoring the damp stains it left on the denim. Victor was watching her. He hadn't moved from the folding chair, but his dark eyes tracked her every movement. The predator was wounded, but he wasn't weak. "Sit down," he ordered softly. "You're shaking." Clara looked at her hands. He was right. A fine, uncontrollable tremor had taken over her fingers. The adrenaline was leaving her system, and the cold reality of the shock was setting in. She walked back across the room, bypassing the metal chair beside him, and slid down the opposite wall until she was sitting on the cold concrete floor. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. "How long do we have to stay down here?" she asked. Her voice sounded thin, hollow. "Until the house is clean," Victor replied. "A few hours." Clara rested her chin on her knees. She closed her eyes. The silence in the room grew heavy, punctuated only by the low hum of the fluorescent lights and the quiet, clipped tones of Tommy speaking Italian into his burner phone. She was trapped underground with a killer. And for the first time in her life, she didn't want to be anywhere else. It was nearly 4 in the morning when the heavy steel door finally unlocked. The hydraulic hiss sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. Tommy pushed the door open, stepping out into the hallway first. He kept his weapon drawn, sweeping the corridor, before lowering it and nodding back into the room. "Clear." Victor stood up. He moved stiffly, his left arm immobilized by a makeshift sling Clara had fashioned from a torn piece of a sterile sheet. He walked out of the bunker without a word. Clara followed. The transition from the sterile, bright bunker to the rest of the house was a physical shock. The air outside the panic room was freezing, drafting violently through the shattered windows. It smelled deeply of cordite burning wood and the sharp, coppery scent of fresh blood. They walked up the stairs in silence. When they reached the main floor, Clara stopped dead. The estate was unrecognizable. The elegant, manicured reality Victor usually maintained had been violently stripped away, revealing the brutal truth beneath it. The heavy oak doors of the library were splintered, hanging off their hinges. The Persian rugs were soaked in dark, spreading stains. Near the entryway of the kitchen, 2 men in heavy industrial coveralls were wrapping a body in thick black plastic. Clara's breath hitched. Her medical training had exposed her to death. She had seen bodies broken by car accidents, ruined by disease. But this was different. This was deliberate, mechanical slaughter. One of the men looked up from the plastic sheeting. He saw Victor gave a brief, silent nod and went back to wrapping the corpse's legs with silver duct tape. Victor didn't look at the body. He looked at Clara. He watched the horror bleed into her features. He watched her eyes wide, her face drain of whatever color had returned to it in the bunker. He saw her take a physical step backward, her sneakers crunching loudly on a pile of shattered glass. This was the line. Victor had spent his entire life watching people reach this exact boundary. They loved the money. They loved the power, the expensive dinners, the untouchable aura that came with standing in his shadow. But the moment they were forced to look at the blood that paid for it all, they broke. They looked at him not as a man, but as a monster. He waited for it. He waited for the disgust to twist her features. He waited for her to turn and run. Instead, Clara looked up from the body and met his eyes. She was terrified. He could see it in the rapid rise and fall of her chest, in the way she swallowed hard. But she didn't look away, and she didn't look at him with disgust. She looked at him with a profound, crushing sorrow. It was infinitely worse. Victor felt something cold and heavy settle in his gut. The possessive, jealous rage that had driven him to that Italian restaurant weeks ago suddenly felt juvenile. He had wanted to own her. He had wanted to pull her into his world and lock the door behind her. But looking at her standing in the wreckage of his violent life smelling the gunpowder and the death, he realized what keeping her would actually cost. It wouldn't just break her professional boundaries. It would rot her from the inside out. He was a disease, and he was finally painfully aware that he didn't want to infect her. "Tommy," Victor said. His voice was flat, devoid of any inflection. Tommy stepped up beside him. "Yeah, boss. Get one of the armored SUVs. Drive Clara home." Clara blinked, stepping forward. "What no? Your shoulder needs to be checked for infection in a few hours. The wound needs redressing. I have to stay and—" "Your contract is terminated," Victor cut her off. The word struck her like a physical blow. She stopped walking. "Excuse me." Victor turned to face her. His expression was a flawless mask of stone. The raw, bleeding man from the bunker was gone. He was the boss again, untouchable, unreadable. "You're done," Victor stated coldly. "The threat level has escalated beyond what a civilian contractor should be exposed to. It's a liability. Tommy will drop you at your apartment. He has a check for the remainder of your contract, plus a severance bonus. Your sister's tuition is paid through graduation. You have no reason to ever return to this property." Clara stared at him. The sorrow in her eyes hardened into something sharp and brittle. "You're throwing me out? I am dismissing you. Because I saw them wrap a body. Because you don't belong here." Victor took a step closer, towering over her. He used the sheer physical intimidation that had worked so well on the accountant. He wanted to scare her away. He needed to. "Look around you, Clara. This isn't a hospital. I am not a patient. This is a slaughterhouse. And you are too soft to survive it." Clara's jaw tightened. She didn't flinch. "I survived tonight. Tonight was a warning. Tomorrow they might burn the house down with us inside." Victor looked past her, signaling to Tommy. "Get her out of here. Now." "I don't need an escort," Clara snapped. Her voice shook with a dangerous mix of anger and sudden, overwhelming grief. "I know the way out." She turned on her heel, her boots crunching over the glass. She didn't look back. She walked out the shattered front doors into the freezing November night. Victor stood in the ruined hallway, listening to the heavy engine of the SUV roar to life outside. He listened as the tires crunched down the gravel driveway, fading into the distance. The house was deadly silent. For the first time in his life, Victor Moretti felt entirely profoundly alone. 3 weeks passed. The city transitioned from autumn to a bitter, freezing winter. Snow piled up on the sidewalks, turning grey and slushy under the tires of the morning traffic. Clara sat at her tiny kitchen table, a mug of cold tea resting between her hands. The heating in her building was broken again, leaving the apartment drafting and miserable. She was wearing her old faded scrubs. Her shift at St. Jude's started in an hour. She had gone back. She had walked into the chaotic, underfunded ER, begged for her old shifts back, and thrown herself into the grueling reality of trauma nursing. It was supposed to feel right. It was supposed to feel like coming up for air after drowning. It felt like nothing. The frantic energy of the hospital, the shouting doctors, the bleeding patients. It all felt small. Muted. She moved through her days like an automaton, checking vitals, pushing meds, smiling politely at the exhausted residents. She checked her banking app. The severance bonus Victor had given her was a staggering sum. It was enough money to buy a house in a quiet suburb, to buy a new car to walk away from, nursing entirely if she wanted to. She hated it. Every time she looked at the numbers, she felt sick. Greg had texted her twice since the restaurant incident. She had deleted the messages without reading them. The thought of sitting across from a man who worried about his golf handicap while discussing spreadsheet macros made her want to scream. Victor had ruined her. He had warned her, sitting at that checkered tablecloth, that wanting things that didn't belong to you led to bad decisions. He had been talking about Greg. He should have been talking about her. She wanted the dark. She missed the heavy, terrifying silence of his study. She missed the sharp, intelligent cruelty in his eyes. She missed the way he looked at her like she was the only real thing in a world made of ghosts. He had pushed her away to protect her. It was the only selfless thing she had ever seen him do, and it enraged her. Clara stood up. She walked into her bedroom and stripped off the cheap, thin scrubs. She threw them into the trash can. She opened her closet and pulled out a heavy black sweater and dark jeans. She dressed quickly, her movements sharp and deliberate. She walked into the bathroom, pulling her hair back into a tight, severe knot. She grabbed her canvas medical bag from the floor of the closet. She hadn't opened it since the night of the attack. She unzipped it, throwing in fresh gauze medical tape, iodine, and heavy-duty painkillers. She zipped it shut, grabbed her coat, and walked out the door. The drive to the estate took 40 minutes. The roads were slick with ice. When she pulled her battered Honda up to the massive wrought-iron gates, the security cameras swiveled immediately, locking onto her windshield. A guard stepped out of the reinforced concrete booth. It wasn't one of the usual men. He was heavily armed, his hand resting casually on the submachine gun slung across his chest. He approached her window. Clara rolled the window down, letting the freezing wind rip into the car. "Name," the guard barked. "Clara Hayes," she said. Her voice was perfectly steady. "I'm here to see Mr. Moretti. Tell him his nurse is here to check his shoulder." The guard frowned, pulling a radio from his belt. He stepped back, muttering into the receiver. Clara kept her eyes forward, her hands gripping the steering wheel. She knew there was a very real chance Victor would just leave her sitting at the gate. A long, agonizing minute passed. Then the heavy iron gates groaned slowly, pulling inward. The guard waved her through. Clara drove up the winding, snow-covered driveway. The estate looked exactly as it had before the attack. The shattered windows were replaced. The blood was scrubbed from the stone. The facade was perfect once again. She parked the car, grabbed her bag, and walked up the front steps. Tommy was waiting for her in the foyer. He looked exhausted, the dark circles under his eyes, rivaling hers. He didn't smile, but he gave her a long, appraising look. "He's in the study," Tommy said, simply stepping aside. Clara walked past him. She didn't knock on the heavy oak doors. She turned the brass knob and pushed them open. The study smelled of old paper scotch and wood smoke. Victor was sitting in the oversized leather armchair by the fire. He wasn't wearing a suit jacket. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar. He had a glass of whiskey in his right hand. His left arm rested stiffly on the armrest. He didn't look up when she walked in. Clara dropped her canvas bag on the floor. The heavy thud echoed in the quiet room. "I explicitly told Tommy that you were not to be allowed on the property," Victor said. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp. He kept his eyes fixed on the fire. "Tommy works for you," Clara said, walking across the Persian rug. "I don't. You fired me, which means you don't get to tell me where I can and cannot go." Victor finally turned his head. The sight of her seemed to physically jar him. He looked at the black sweater, the severe bun, the absolute cold determination in her hazel eyes. "Why are you here, Clara?" "To check your shoulder." She stopped in front of his chair. "It's healing. I'll be the judge of that. Take your shirt off." Victor stared at her. "You are making a mistake. I gave you an out. I gave you a clean life. You take one more step into this room and I will never let you leave again. I won't pretend to be noble a second time." "I don't want a clean life," Clara said. The admission hung in the air, heavy and fatal. She reached out, grabbing the edge of his glass. She pulled the whiskey out of his hand and set it on the side table. Then her fingers moved to the buttons of his shirt. She didn't tremble. She was brutally efficient. She pushed the fabric off his injured shoulder. The scar was angry, puckered, and red. It was healing, but it was ugly. A permanent mark. Victor didn't move. He barely breathed. He watched her face as she ran her fingers lightly over the damaged tissue. "I tried going back," Clara whispered, her eyes fixed on the scar. I tried the safe route. It felt like I was already dead. She looked up, meeting his dark, predatory gaze. There was no fear left, only acceptance. You're a monster, Victor, she said quietly. You ruin everything you touch. But I think I'm ruined too. Victor reached up with his uninjured hand. He gripped the back of her neck, his calloused fingers tangling in her hair exactly as they had weeks ago. He pulled her down. She didn't resist. She let him drag her into the dark. Good, Victor breathed against her mouth. Then we'll burn the rest of it down together. The dust has settled. But Victor and Clara's story proves that the darkest places often hold the most undeniable truths. If this grounded, slow-burn mafia romance kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and subscribe for more high-stakes storytelling. Share this video with a fellow dark romance reader who loves a dangerous hero and a defiant heroine. Drop a comment below to share your thoughts on Clara's final choice to step into the fire.